March 1945. The western bank of the Rhine lay drowned in darkness. Cold mist rolled through the fields near Wesel, muffling every sound except the distant hum of truck engines. Through binoculars, German officers scanned the opposite shore, their eyes catching glimpses of shadowy tanks, rows of half-tracks, and columns of men moving beneath dim lamps. The silhouettes stretched for miles. It looked like the U.S. Ninth Army was preparing for a full-scale crossing. Searchlights swept the horizon. Static crackled on German radios. Intercepted transmissions mentioned bridgeheads, armor concentration, and phase blue. The officers smirked. The Allies were predictable. They would hit here. Then came the roar of engines. Deep, rhythmic, mechanical. A battalion's worth of sound filling the night air. Soldiers in the German trenches tensed. Orders went out. Artillery was repositioned. Infantry deployed. But when dawn broke, the landscape was empty. No tanks, no troops. Only flattened grass, tire tracks that led nowhere, and the faint smell of burning rubber. The mighty armored column they had seen had never existed. That morning, the German command didn't realize they had just fought shadows. An army of artists and illusionists, whose greatest weapon was imagination itself. By the spring of 1944, the war in Europe had become a chessboard of deception. Every mile of advance required not just courage, but illusion. A calculated dance to make the enemy see what wasn't there. The Allies knew the Germans were still deadly, still watching, and still capable of counterstrikes that could devastate any exposed flank. Intelligence had become as lethal as artillery. In this shadow war, information was ammunition. After the invasion of Normandy on June 6, 1944, Allied forces surged inland, breaking through the hedgerows of France. By late summer, Paris was liberated. But every gain came with cost. Ambushes, minefields, and relentless resistance. The Wehrmacht, though fractured, still had claws. And in Hitler's command posts, deception had become paranoia. False reports, phantom divisions, and camouflage were daily tools on both sides. It was in this climate that the U.S. Army decided to weaponize illusion itself. The concept wasn't new. The British had pioneered similar tricks in North Africa, hiding tanks under fake tents, creating false airfields, and even inflating dummy aircraft. What America added was scale, coordination, and showmanship. This wasn't mere camouflage, it was theater on the battlefield. The roots of this plan reached back to 1943, as American strategists studied the success of British operations like Operation Bertram, the Grand Deception before El Alamein. They saw the value in confusion. A well-timed illusion could save thousands of lives. A phantom army could hold an enemy division in place, while the real one struck elsewhere. War, they realized, could be manipulated like a magician's stage. But to turn that idea into a functioning military unit required people who thought differently. Not just soldiers, but creators. In early 1944, the U.S. Army's Engineer Corps and the Signal Corps quietly began recruiting men from unexpected places. Art schools, advertising agencies, and design studios. Posters appeared at Yale, Cooper Union, Pratt Institute, and the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts, asking for artists to serve their country in a unique way. By summer, the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops was born. Its mission was so secret that even most within the Army had no idea it existed. The soldiers inside it were not frontline fighters. They were illusionists, painters, set designers, radio specialists, and sound engineers. Their task: to deceive the enemy by any means necessary. Under the overall command of Colonel Harry L. Reeder, and guided by deception planners from SHAEF, Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, the unit drew together three specialized components. The 603rd Camouflage Engineers designed visual illusions, inflatable tanks, dummy trucks, false artillery emplacements. The 3132nd Signal Service Company faked radio traffic, imitating entire divisions' chatter across frequencies. The 3103rd Sound Company used powerful loudspeakers mounted on half-tracks to broadcast pre-recorded battle sounds. tanks moving, engineers working, pontoon bridges being built, all timed to fool enemy patrols. These men were told little of what lay ahead. They were trained not in how to kill, but how to vanish. Their manuals didn't describe assault tactics, but stagecraft and misdirection. When they practiced, it looked more like a movie set than a battlefield. Rubber tanks rising from flat ground, sound crews layering recordings of Sherman engines, and painters working through the night to make plywood vehicles shimmer like real steel under moonlight. They became soldiers of illusion, each trained to deceive the sharpest military minds of the German high command. And as the Allied armies closed in on the German frontier, their moment was coming. Soon, they would be unleashed across Europe, from Normandy to the Rhine, to conjure entire phantom divisions and lead the enemy into empty traps. But before the Ghost Army could perform its masterpiece, it first had to prove that deception could truly alter the course of war. And that test began in France, under fire, where their illusions would meet the brutal reality of combat. The first test of the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops came in the chaotic months after D-Day. France was a patchwork of burning towns, wrecked bridges, and advancing columns of Allied armor. The Germans had fallen back but not broken. Each riverline and crossroads became a possible ambush. The High Command needed flexibility, real divisions to push, and fake ones to confuse. The Ghost Army's trial by fire began in late July 1944, during Operation Cobra, the American breakout from Normandy. The U.S. 2nd Armored Division needed to shift secretly toward Avranches. To cover the movement, a small detachment from the 23rd was ordered to create a convincing illusion of armor still positioned near St. Lo. Within hours, inflatable Shermans and half-tracks appeared in open fields, their shadows painted to match the sun's angle. Sound crews rolled out their recordings of tank engines and clattering tracks. At night, a single jeep with flashing lights simulated columns of moving vehicles. The deception worked. German reconnaissance reported a strong armored presence where none existed, slowing their redeployment. For the first time, illusion had bought the Allies real time and saved real lives. Encouraged, the High Command expanded the unit's authority. The 23rd began moving with the front, its mission changing from experiment to essential weapon. They performed dozens of operations across France, Luxembourg, Belgium, and eventually Germany itself. Each assignment demanded new creativity. Their camouflage engineers studied aerial photos to match local terrain and paint patterns that blended with surrounding units. They learned to replicate divisional markings, every number, insignia, and motor pool stencil, so that even Allied soldiers passing nearby believed the illusion. The radio operators listened for real division chatter, then copied its tone, rhythm, and technical quirks. They transmitted day and night, sometimes creating entire phantom command networks. The sound teams, trained under the direction of engineers from Bell Labs and the movie industry, could project recordings up to 15 miles away. Using giant 500-pound speakers, they created the illusion of construction work, tank convoys, or infantry movement. Everything was calculated: the wind direction, echo pattern, and playback timing. It was deception engineered with scientific precision. By autumn, their reputation inside Allied circles grew quietly. Commanders began to request them by code name. 23rd, Sonic Company, the Artists. Their unofficial emblem, an absurd ghost holding a lightning bolt, appeared on painted signs hidden from outsiders. Only a handful of generals knew their true size and purpose, but the work was dangerous. The Ghost Army often operated within artillery range of German forces, and sometimes only a few hundred yards from the front. Their defenses were minimal: rifles, sidearms, and their wits. If discovered, they could be wiped out in minutes. More than once, German patrols stumbled upon their decoys or fired on what they thought were tanks, only to find rubber shells deflating under gunfire. Despite the risks, their illusions continued to grow in scale. During Operation Brest, they mimicked an entire corps to divert attention from the real assault. At Metz and Arlon, they faked artillery concentrations to mask the movements of General Patton's Third Army. In all, They conducted more than 20 major deceptions across the Western Front. Behind the bravado, though the men knew their mission depended on secrecy, they were told never to discuss their work, even among other units. Letters home were censored. Official records omitted their names. To outsiders, they were simply engineers or radio men. Still, word spread in whispers. Soldiers who had fought nearby swore they'd seen entire divisions vanish overnight. Local villagers told stories of tanks that melted with the sunrise. German prisoners later admitted they were bewildered by American movements, unable to tell real divisions from ghosts. By early 1945, as Allied forces prepared for the final push into Germany, the Ghost Army was no longer a novelty. It was a trusted instrument of war. The Rhine River stood as the last great barrier. The Germans fortified every bridge, mined every approach, and waited for the inevitable crossing. The Allies planned dozens of feints to misdirect German defenders. Among them was one of the boldest operations of deception ever attempted on European soil. Its goal? To convince the enemy that an entire armored division, complete with artillery and engineers, was massing for an assault at a point where no real crossing would occur. It would be called Operation Viersen, and it would be the Ghost Army's masterpiece. In every war story, there are men who fight with rifles and others who fight with ideas. The Ghost Army was made of the latter. They were artists turned soldiers, men who had once painted landscapes, designed theater sets, and drawn advertising posters, now wearing olive-drab uniforms and carrying sketchbooks into battle. Among them was Bill Blass, who would later become one of America's most famous fashion designers. There was Ellsworth Kelly, future minimalist painter. Arthur Singer, who once illustrated birds for magazines, now painted fake insignias for phantom divisions. Each came from a world of creation, not destruction. And yet, in Europe, their creativity became a weapon sharper than steel. Their barracks often felt more like art studios than army camps. Canvas, brushes, plaster molds, and buckets of paint filled their tents. But outside, war thundered. They watched columns of real soldiers heading to the front, young men who might never return, while they themselves built illusions to protect them. Many felt a strange guilt. They were soldiers, yet their mission was to pretend. But the longer they worked, the clearer their purpose became. Every time their deception succeeded, thousands of Allied lives were spared. Their art became a shield. The tactical complexity behind these illusions was staggering. Nothing was random. When the 23rd was assigned a new deception, reconnaissance teams would scout the terrain, studying road networks, elevation, and sunlight direction. They mapped out where each dummy tank, truck, and artillery piece should stand to create a convincing composition from the air. Then came the sound planners, calculating how the echo of engines would carry across valleys or rivers. The radio team plotted its broadcast schedule to mimic the chatter of a real division. Logistics, requests for ammunition, fake reports of fuel shortages. Even the pattern of messages was designed to match known habits of specific U.S. divisions. If the 4th Armored was supposedly in the area, its radio ghost was crafted perfectly, down to the slang used by its operators. The operations unfolded with military choreography. Within hours, open fields became bustling camps. Inflatable Sherman tanks were rolled out and filled with air compressors. Canvas trucks appeared on dirt roads, their paint scuffed to look used. Dummy artillery batteries pointed toward German lines, complete with sandbag emplacements and fake gun crews made of mannequins. At night, engineers strung rows of lights along roads, mimicking vehicle convoys. Campfires flickered. The sound trucks blasted recordings of pontoon bridges being built. It was a full sensory hallucination. The Germans, whose aerial reconnaissance relied heavily on pattern recognition, often took the bait. From the air, the illusions looked authentic. The decoys even cast realistic shadows. In the confusion of retreat and shortage of intelligence, the German command reported large enemy movements that didn't exist. Entire battalions were redirected based on nothing but air and paint. But the power of deception wasn't only tactical, it was psychological. The Ghost Army preyed on fear and expectation. The German army, battered and retreating, was haunted by the thought of Allied superiority. Endless divisions, ceaseless armor, limitless resources. The illusions reinforced that nightmare. Captured enemy soldiers later confessed they believed the Americans had double the real number of tanks. One officer remarked, "They appeared everywhere at once." That perception, more than any weapon, helped break German morale. Within the Ghost Army, however, there was another kind of psychological strain. The men lived a double life. They trained as artists, yet operated like spies. They were ordered to draw attention, yet remain invisible. If captured, they couldn't explain their mission. They had no official recognition, no unit patches that revealed their true name. To many, the secrecy felt suffocating. Yet their work created moments of surreal humor. Once, after setting up a fake tank line near the front, they inflated a dummy Sherman too close to a village. When local children wandered by, one boy poked it with a stick and watched the tank collapse. The next day, the Germans shelled the empty field, believing they had destroyed a major force. By late 1944, the Ghost Army had perfected the rhythm of illusion. Scout, stage, sound, transmit, vanish. They could build and remove an entire armored division in less than 24 hours. To the Germans, it looked like magic. To the Allies, it was protection by deception. But for the men who lived it, every success came with the same haunting question. How long could imagination outwit artillery? The answer would come on the banks of the Rhine, where illusion and war would collide one final time. Every illusion needs direction. And for the Ghost Army, leadership was its invisible backbone. At the top stood Colonel Harry L. Reeder, a calm, analytical man who understood both engineering and theater. He had the patience of an architect and the instincts of a gambler. Reeder knew that for deception to succeed, every detail had to align. The fake had to behave like the real. He encouraged his men to think like the enemy. If you were the German artillery observer, what would you expect to see through your binoculars? Under him, lieutenants commanded not platoons of infantry, but platoons of illusion. Captain Fred Fox oversaw radio deception. Lieutenant George Reb coordinated visual setups. Sound operations were run by officers who treated their trucks like rolling theaters. Each component worked independently, yet in perfect synchrony. Their headquarters often moved at night, setting up illusions under blackout conditions. Orders were whispered, compressors hissed, and canvas skins inflated into hulking forms that glimmered faintly under starlight. From above, it looked like an army on the move. On the ground, it was a quiet orchestra of noise and nerves. The 23rd's technological arsenal was unlike anything the war had seen. Their inflatable tanks, designed by Goodyear and rubber manufacturers, could be set up by 4 men in under 30 minutes. The units carried hundreds of these in trucks, folded flat. When inflated, they were almost indistinguishable from real Shermans, M10 tank destroyers, or 150mm artillery pieces. Engineers even dusted them with graphite powder to give the illusion of metallic sheen. Then there were the sound trucks. Each half-track carried massive amplifiers and loudspeakers capable of projecting recordings up to 15 miles. Bell Labs had helped design the system, mixing authentic field recordings from Fort Knox and other training grounds. Crews edited the sounds with precision. If the deception required a bridge-building scene, they mixed hammering, chain clatter, and shouted orders. If it was an armor convoy, they layered engine revs, gear shifts, and squealing tracks. The playback timing was planned like a concert. Complementing this was the radio deception team, the invisible voice of the Phantom divisions. Operators built entire fake radio networks, transmitting coded chatter that matched known call signs of real divisions. They replicated the small errors, tempo, and personality of each operator. To any German signals intelligence unit listening, the deception sounded authentic. Together, these elements formed what Allied planners called full-spectrum deception. The goal wasn't just to fool the eye or ear. It was to overwhelm the enemy's senses and make illusion indistinguishable from truth. German intelligence, once among the finest in the world, was now stretched thin. Their Luftwaffe reconnaissance flights were limited by fuel shortages and Allied air superiority. Field commanders often relied on intercepted radio traffic or civilian reports, both easily manipulated. The Ghost Army exploited this vulnerability mercilessly. In several operations, they made the Germans believe entire corps were shifting positions. Commanders on the other side of the front drew false conclusions, repositioning forces that never needed to move. One such miscalculation allowed the U.S. Ninth Army to cross the Rhine River virtually unopposed, all because German units had been drawn away by an illusion. To the Allied command, deception had become as crucial as artillery. Generals like Omar Bradley and George S. Patton recognized its strategic value. Patton, himself a master of psychological warfare, famously told his staff that wars are won with the imagination. When the 23rd operated near his Third Army, he approved their missions with enthusiasm. He understood that while tanks destroyed, deception paralyzed. But leadership within the Ghost Army also required moral courage. These men knew that if their positions were discovered, they were defenseless. Their weapons were soundtracks and rubber. Their enemies were steel and fire. They operated within artillery range, often under direct observation, risking everything on the hope that their illusion would hold. There were moments when it nearly didn't. In Luxembourg, German shells once hit a dummy tank line, setting inflatables ablaze. Another time, a patrol stumbled upon a tank park and realized too late what they were shooting at. Yet these failures only refined their craft. Every near miss taught them how to build better lies. From a German perspective, the confusion grew unbearable. Reports contradicted one another. Armored divisions appeared where no fuel convoys had passed. Radio chatter suggested bridgeheads that never formed. Field commanders began doubting their intelligence altogether. That paralysis, born from mistrust of their own senses, was the Ghost Army's ultimate victory. The enemy never fully grasped what was happening. They believed they were facing superior numbers, not superior imagination. It was a victory of art over artillery, of creativity over calculation. As winter gave way to spring in 1945, the final act of this theater of war approached. The Rhine River loomed, Germany's last great defensive barrier. The real U.S. Ninth Army would cross near Wesel. But to ensure success, another division had to appear farther south, a phantom force to draw the enemy's gaze. That task would fall to the Ghost Army. Their stage was set, their tools ready, and the world was about to witness the night when shadows moved. March 1945. The Rhine River, broad, cold, and fast, was the final wall between the Western Allies and the heart of Germany. Beyond its far bank lay the industrial Ruhr, the core of Hitler's war machine. The Reich was collapsing, but it would not die quietly. German engineers had blown bridges, fortified towns, and mined every crossing point. For the U.S. Ninth Army, the challenge was not only to cross, but to do it unseen. That is where the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops stepped in. Their mission, to stage a full-scale fake crossing near the town of Viersen, 20 miles south of the real one. This deception, known as Operation Viersen, was designed to convince German commanders that the main Allied thrust would come from this false bridgehead. If successful, it would divert artillery and armor away from the true crossing near Wesel. The stakes were enormous. The Rhine was not just a river, it was a symbol. For months, Nazi propaganda had claimed it would never be breached. Hitler himself had declared it Germany's last inviolable line. To cross it would mean breaking the spell of invincibility. To misdirect the Germans at that moment could shorten the war by weeks, maybe save thousands of lives. The Ghost Army arrived near Viersen under strict secrecy. Orders were delivered verbally. Maps were marked with coded overlays. Even neighboring Allied units were told only that engineer exercises were being conducted. In reality, they were preparing one of the most elaborate illusions of World War II. First came the visual deception. The 603rd Camouflage engineers selected open fields near the Rhine's west bank. Within 24 hours, they transformed them into what looked like an armored assembly area. Inflatable Sherman tanks, 1/5 howitzers, and trucks appeared by the dozens. Camouflage netting draped across hedgerows, creating depth and shadow. The men painted tire ruts into the mud, imitating the weight of real convoys. At night, rows of dimly lit tents glowed faintly across the landscape, a field camp that never existed. Then the radio deception began. Operators of the 3102nd Signal Company established an entire network mimicking the real 30th and 79th Infantry Divisions. Their transmissions followed authentic routines, coded messages, logistic requests, even fake reports of bridge materials arriving. Each voice carried the rhythm of seasoned radio operators. To any German listening post, it sounded like a genuine command net coordinating an imminent crossing. Finally, the sound deception went live. The 3133rd Sound Company rolled their half-tracks to the riverbanks. From hidden positions, they played recordings captured months earlier at Fort Knox. Tanks clanking over steel ramps, bulldozers clearing obstacles, pontoon bridge sections being dropped into water. Each night the sounds grew louder, as if a real assault was approaching. From the German side, scouts and observers reported exactly what the Allies wanted them to see: an army preparing to storm the Rhine. Reconnaissance planes, flying low in the pale light of early dawn, captured photographs of what seemed to be hundreds of armored vehicles massing near Viersen. Intelligence analysts in Düsseldorf and Essen concluded that a major crossing was imminent in that sector. Orders went out to reposition artillery southward to face the Phantom Army. Meanwhile, the real Ninth Army was silently preparing to cross farther north near Wesel, where the Ghost Army's illusions had drawn German eyes away. For the men of the 23rd, the operation felt surreal. They were surrounded by their own creations, silent rubber tanks glistening with dew, speakers humming softly, radio chatter filling the air. They knew that a single German patrol could unravel everything. But discipline held. For 3 nights they maintained the illusion with military precision. Civilians from nearby villages peered at the strange encampments and whispered rumors of an impending attack. Even some Allied soldiers passing through were fooled. They saluted the dummy tanks, thinking they were part of a real armored column. On March 22nd, the deception reached its peak. The sound trucks roared through the night, engines revving, cranes clanging, men shouting orders across the bridge site. German artillery opened fire, pounding the area with high explosive shells. The Ghost Army took cover in shallow trenches, watching explosions rip through fields of rubber tanks. Dozens were shredded, deflating like collapsed beasts. But to the Germans, it looked like successful defensive fire, and that was the point. Every shell fired at Viersen was one not fired at Wesel. By the time dawn broke on March 23rd, the real U.S. Ninth Army had already begun crossing the Rhine, virtually unopposed. Patton's Third Army crossed soon after. Within days, the Western Front had cracked open. The German command, realizing too late that they had been deceived, scrambled to reposition. But the momentum was gone. The illusion had worked perfectly. That night, as the Ghost Army packed up their equipment and watched smoke rise over the real crossings to the north, they knew they had just staged their most important show, and their last. The war was nearing its end. But for these soldiers of shadows, the most haunting moment was still to come, when the enemy finally understood what had fooled them. As the Rhine operations unfolded, the success of Operation Viersen rippled across the front lines like a whispered legend. To most Allied soldiers, it was just another mysterious diversion, another engineer exercise that had somehow kept the Germans guessing. But within the small secret world of the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, it was the culmination of everything they had trained for, and the most dangerous mission they would ever attempt. On the third night of the deception, the German High Command grew increasingly anxious. Their field intelligence painted a chaotic picture. Reports of armored convoys near Viersen, bridge construction noises on the river, and constant radio traffic from units believed to be the 30th and 79th Divisions. To them, it was clear. The Americans were preparing a massive assault. Orders were sent down from Army Group B. Reinforce Viersen, counterattack at dawn. But the German reinforcements never made it in time. By then, the real U.S. Ninth Army, 20 miles north, had already crossed the Rhine at Wesel under the cover of darkness. The Germans had taken the bait completely. Their artillery fire, intended for the real crossing, had pounded empty fields filled with rubber and paint. Inside the Ghost Army's camp, the men crouched in shallow ditches as shells burst around them. Each explosion sent waves of heat and dirt through the air, toppling inflatable tanks and shredding canvas trucks. There was no heroism in this kind of combat, only patience and nerve. The illusionists had to let the enemy believe they were being hit. To retreat too soon would reveal the trick. So they stayed, motionless, as if the fake tanks were real ones under fire. When the barrage stopped, teams immediately went to work repairing damage, re-inflating dummies, repainting scorch marks, restitching broken vehicles. The goal was simple. By dawn, the field had to look exactly as it did before the shelling. If German reconnaissance aircraft returned, they needed to see destruction that matched their expectations. And so the illusion deepened. Even the damage was part of the deception. That morning, when German pilots flew reconnaissance missions, they photographed the scene from high above. Burn marks, destroyed tanks, smoke columns, everything fit their narrative. Intelligence confirmed. The Americans had suffered losses at Viersen. The deception was now complete. Meanwhile, north of them, the thunder of real artillery shook the earth. Operation Plunder, the true Rhine crossing, had begun. Under cover of smoke screens and darkness, British and American engineers built real pontoon bridges while Patton's tanks rumbled across. The German forces, their attention drawn south by the Ghost Army's spectacle, were too late to react effectively. The Rhine barrier, once declared unbreakable, was now shattered. Colonel Reeder's men watched the victory unfold from afar. They had no glory to claim, no medals to pin, no front-page headlines. Their triumph was invisible, measured not in ground taken, but in shots not fired, in lives not lost. The official reports later confirmed what they already knew. The deception had worked perfectly. German command had shifted major artillery and infantry units southward, believing the Ninth Army's crossing would occur at Viersen. When they realized their mistake, it was too late. Allied armor was already deep in the Ruhr heartland. But even as the success was celebrated quietly within the 23rd, there was a somber undertone. The illusion had cost them dearly in nerves and risk. During the shelling at Viersen, several men were wounded. Others barely escaped when fires ignited near the sound trucks. For many, the memory of those nights, of lying in the mud surrounded by collapsing tanks of air, would stay forever etched in silence. As the Rhine crossings expanded, the Ghost Army prepared for what would become its final missions. Germany was collapsing from within. Allied divisions advanced in waves. Yet even in the dying days of the war, the 23rd was called upon one more time to simulate the advance of armored columns racing toward the Elbe. Once again, their illusions forced German remnants to surrender or retreat prematurely, unwilling to face armies that didn't exist. When the shooting finally stopped in May 1945 and the Reich lay in ruins, the men of the Ghost Army packed away their strange equipment for the last time. Inflatable tanks were deflated and buried. Sound recordings were sealed in wooden crates. Radio logs were classified and locked in archives. Their mission, one of the strangest in military history, vanished as quietly as it had appeared. They were forbidden to talk about what they had done. Officially, the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops didn't exist. Their deception had been so successful that it remained a secret for nearly 50 years. Many of them returned home, resumed their careers as painters, designers, and teachers, carrying with them memories of a war fought not with bullets, but with imagination. Yet among those who knew, the legacy of Operation Viersen lingered. Generals called it one of the most skillful acts of deception in the European theater. It had forced the enemy to move, to hesitate, to fight phantoms, and in doing so, it had opened the road into Germany. In the end, the Ghost Army had proved something no strategist could have predicted at the start of the war. That perception could be as powerful as firepower. Their illusions had reshaped the battlefield and rewritten the limits of warfare itself. As the final echoes of artillery faded across the Rhine, the shadows of that night, the ones that had moved, deceived and vanished, remained in silence. Their battle was unseen, their victory invisible, but history would remember them as the soldiers who fought without firing a shot, and still won. When the Rhine crossings ended and Germany began to crumble from within, the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops quietly folded its tents, packed its air compressors, and disappeared from the European landscape. There were no victory parades for them, no speeches, no medals pinned on chests in front of flags. Their tanks had been made of rubber, their guns of air, and their victories, by necessity, invisible. Official communiqué mentioned the Rhine crossing only as a triumph of planning and coordination by the 9th Army and the British Second Army. Not a single line referred to the phantom force at Viersen that had drawn German fire and confusion. The men of the Ghost Army knew why. Secrecy. Their existence remained classified, their actions buried in sealed reports stamped top secret. For those who had lived it, the sudden quiet felt surreal. One day they were under shell fire beside inflatable tanks. The next, they were artists again, packing brushes and notebooks into duffel bags. Many returned home on crowded troop ships, slipping back into civilian life unnoticed. Friends and family asked where they had served, and most simply said, "In Europe, with engineers." The truth stayed locked away. They had been warned never to discuss operations, even casually. The U.S. Army had plans to keep deception tactics secret for future wars. For the veterans, silence became habit. Some felt pride. Others felt an emptiness they couldn't explain. They had risked their lives without firing a shot, and their success could never be publicly known. In the years that followed, the Ghost Army's work remained hidden even from historians. Its records sat buried in military archives, and its members scattered across America. Bill Blass returned to fashion, eventually building one of the most respected design houses in the world. Ellsworth Kelly became an icon of modern art. Arthur Singer painted birds again. Vibrant, living things, so different from the camouflage he once applied to fake tanks. But for all their post-war success, a quiet bond tied them to that strange, secret mission. Some reunited privately, sharing memories of those eerie nights by the Rhine. The sound of recorded tanks echoing through fog. The eerie sight of their own shadows cast on rubber hulls. They spoke of fear, absurdity, and pride. Of the odd satisfaction of fooling an army that had once terrified the world. Within the military, a few senior officers tried to preserve their legacy. Reports from Schaff praised Operation Viersen and earlier missions in Metz, Arlen, and Luxembourg. One general noted, "Their deceptions saved many lives and confused the enemy to a remarkable degree." But those comments stayed confined to internal memos. By the time the men of the 23rd returned home, the world had moved on to new fears. The atomic age, the Cold War, Korea. Deception, once their secret art, was now practiced with new tools. Radar jamming, electronic warfare, misinformation. The Ghost Army had been the prototype, yet for those who had built it, the emotional weight of their role remained. They had seen war's most horrific faces, but their contribution was a quieter defiance, proving that creativity could be as powerful as violence. In later years, some would say that the Ghost Army was not just a military unit, but a statement. That imagination, when disciplined and directed, could save lives. Still, none of them could have predicted how long it would take for the world to know their story. Decades would pass before their secret would finally come to light. And when it did, it would astonish historians, not for its deception, but for its humanity, because behind every illusion of war stood real men, who painted, played sounds, and risked death so that others might live. For nearly half a century, the Ghost Army remained a rumor, mentioned only in obscure unit rosters and half-erased wartime notes. Even the men who served in it rarely spoke of it. They aged, raised families, built careers, and lived as quiet veterans among millions of others. Their photographs of inflatable tanks gathered dust in shoeboxes. Their sketches of fake camps yellowed in attics. It wasn't until the early 1980s that fragments of their story began to surface. A handful of veterans, no longer bound by the same level of secrecy, began reaching out to one another. One of them, Ralph Ingersoll, a wartime planner and journalist who had helped shape Allied deception doctrine, confirmed what few believed, that there had been a full U.S. unit dedicated entirely to illusion. Researchers started digging through declassified files, uncovering strange after-action reports, equipment lists for visual simulation materials, and logs referencing dummy installations. By the 1990s, historians and filmmakers pieced the puzzle together. The 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, once erased from public record, emerged as one of the most extraordinary units of World War II. They had conducted more than 20 major deceptions across Europe, each one designed to confuse, delay, or divert German forces. Their operations had saved tens of thousands of Allied lives. The veterans themselves, now old men, were stunned by the renewed attention. Some laughed at the word ghost, remembering nights spent inflating tanks in freezing mud. Others grew emotional, finally seeing their secret recognized. "We fought with paint and sound," one said, "but it was still war." In 1996, the U.S. Army officially declassified the records of the Ghost Army. Historians pored over reports detailing each operation: Metz, Brest, Arlon, Luxembourg, and finally Viersen. The data confirmed what the veterans had always known. Their illusions had drawn entire German divisions away from real combat zones. In some cases, they had forced the enemy to waste thousands of artillery shells on empty fields. Recognition came slowly but steadily. Exhibitions were held at art museums and military history centers. Photographs of inflatable Shermans, once absurd curiosities, became symbols of ingenuity. Veterans of the 23rd began receiving long overdue honors. Their work was featured in documentaries, books, and finally in the halls of Congress. In 2022, more than 75 years after the end of the war, the United States formally awarded the Congressional Gold Medal to the Ghost Army. The citation praised their unique and highly distinguished service in conducting deception operations in Europe during World War II, saving countless lives and shortening the war. Only a handful of surviving members were alive to witness it. They stood, frail but proud, as history finally said their name aloud. What made their story resonate so deeply was not only the cleverness of their methods, but their humanity. These were not hardened soldiers. They were sculptors, photographers, architects, sound technicians, men who turned the tools of creativity into instruments of survival. They had fought violence with illusion, using imagination to shield others from death. In interviews late in life, many said they never felt like heroes. "We just did our job," one remarked quietly. But to military historians, their contribution was profound. They had pioneered the principles that would later define modern psychological operations, electronic warfare, and battlefield deception. The tactics they invented, false radio networks, visual misdirection, sound projection, became the foundation for Cold War strategy and beyond. The Ghost Army had shown that war could be fought not only with strength, but with wit, and in doing so, they had rewritten the nature of conflict itself. By the time the last of them passed, their story had become part of American legend, a secret once hidden in silence, now taught in military academies and memorialized in film. The men who once fooled the German army under moonlight had finally been seen in the light of truth. In the long, haunted memory of World War II, the Ghost Army stands apart, not for the battles it fought, but for the ones it prevented. Their legacy is a quiet paradox. Artists who went to war not to destroy but to deceive. Soldiers who saved lives by turning imagination into armor. Their story reminds us that war is not always about the size of guns or the number of men, but the power of the mind behind them. On the banks of the Rhine, as their phantom tanks shimmered under moonlight and their recorded engines echoed through the night, they proved that illusion, when wielded with precision and courage, can be as decisive as firepower. They fought in the shadows, unseen and unsung, Yet every deception they staged carried a moral weight far heavier than rubber and sound. Each operation was a gamble with their lives, standing under shell fire beside inflatable tanks, trusting that belief itself could protect them. It was warfare turned inside out, truth hidden behind lies, and lives preserved by illusion. Long after the guns fell silent, their art would ripple forward through time. Modern armies now use decoys, holograms, and digital misdirection, technologies that trace their roots back to the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops. Every modern deception owes a debt to those young men who once painted shadows in Europe. But beyond tactics and strategy, their story leaves a human lesson, that creativity, empathy, and intelligence can have a place even amid chaos. The Ghost Army did not win their war with hatred. They won it with craft, patience, and imagination. In a world still scarred by conflict, their legacy endures as a rare kind of hope, that even in humanity's darkest hour, there were those who used art not to glorify war, but to outsmart it. And somewhere, in the mist over the Rhine, the ghosts of that invisible army still march, silent, clever, undefeated.